This is a special two-part episode of Words and Numbers that sort of took on a life of its own. As our regular listeners know, last January I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, switching out my academic career for a career in banking. I put out a call to listeners in the D.C. area who might want to get together for coffee. Before I knew it, that afternoon coffee had taken on a life of its own. 40 listeners ended up descending on D.C. for the weekend, several flying in from as far away as Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Ohio. Andra Mount, longtime listener and organizer of all things Words and Numbers, put together a day trip into D.C. In the evening, everyone gathered for food, drink, and conversation. Clark Neily, who has appeared on numerous episodes, hosted the event at his house. Phil Magness and Mikhail Rasner, each of whom have also appeared on multiple episodes, joined us also. What you're about to hear is the live recording we made that evening, just 4 days after the 2024 presidential election. James and I give special thanks to Clark for hosting the event, to Andra for organizing and coordinating, and to the many listeners who put forth the effort and expense to join us. Week after week, we send out our thoughts, hoping that someone out there is listening. The email we receive, the generous donations from our Patreon sponsors, and the outpouring of support so many of you gave just by showing up for this event give us hope that our efforts do yield good fruit. Part 1 of this two-part episode is our conversation. Part 2 contains questions from the people in the room, and we will air these two parts in 2 consecutive weeks. I apologize in advance for the sound quality. We had 3 microphones, one of which I had configured incorrectly. So while you'll get good quality on James, Phil's, and Mikhail's voices, Clark and I sound like we're yelling into tuna cans. But hang in there, the group we assembled this week delivered a top-notch episode.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
And we're sitting here in Clark Neely's house with 30 or 40 Words and Numbers listeners. If you just say your name so that the listeners can recognize your voice.
So this is Clark. I'm the host, and I want to explain the shots because I think it's important. This originated with James and I having a bet about who had the most humiliating story involving self-infliction of pepper spray. And he was generous enough in spirit to say that mine was also pretty awful. And so the bet was, you get to pick any gross shot out of my liquor cabinet to inflict on the other ones. We've inflicted shots, and then all the other ones agreed that they would participate. So now it's just a melange. I have no idea what shots are in front of anybody. They're all clear. Let's see. We have absinthe. We have tequila. We have vodka. We have gin. And we have something most of you have never heard of called Batavia Iraq, which is what they used to give to British sailors in the East Indies when they couldn't have access to anything else. It's the nastiest distillation of rice that you could possibly imagine if you...
And that one is for me.
Well, I don't know. I don't know who's got what.
I've got it right in front of me.
So that's where we are. Phil, if you could take much less time to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Phil Magness. I'm the David J. Thoreau Chair at the Independent Institute, general troublemaker and scourge of the economic left.
My name is Mikhail Rasner. I am notably the supply chain guy. Equally as surprised that I'm more popular than anyone here. Good company to keep, and the company I own is called Mere United.
Hi, I'm James.
We've just passed the election. You want to talk about it?
Not especially, no.
I do. Let me throw out one thing.
There we go.
I was looking at a map of the counties of the U.S. and how they voted Republican, Democrat. Of course, it's red and blue. On left side of the screen. On the right side of the screen, I put population density of the United States by county. And those two things are remarkably the same.
Shockingly, it matches up perfectly.
Wow. Yeah.
This is the exact argument against voting for the president by popular vote.
Yes.
Right, because you'd end up with the 10 or so biggest cities in the United States deciding the presidency every single time, and it would lurch far to the left of where we tend to end up.
what is it that when you get lots of humans together in a small space, they vote Democrat?
Well, I'm going to pass this microphone off to Phil in just a second, but this is a problem, if you want to call it a problem. It's a problem that we've had in the United States since the founding, where we had the interest of the people who lived in cities and the interests of the people who lived in the country. And when you read The Federalist, right, the various essays that support the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, what you find is that they're trying to split the difference here and make it so everybody's interest was pretty well represented. And I think the Electoral College did a hell of a good job at that. It doesn't exactly do what it was ostensibly designed to do. There were a few things it was meant to do that it doesn't really do anymore. But this is the one thing that it does extraordinarily well. So, Phil, if you've got anything to say on that topic, I suspect you do.
Yeah, it's a derivative of a problem known as Hamiltonians. They've been around since the beginning as well.
That was the interest of the people in the cities.
Yes, yeah, very much economically oriented toward government taking a more proactive role in everything.
In essence, we could talk about bankers and farmers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it really boils down to here.
Yes, you've got agricultural interests are one of the first major factions of the U.S. government when it founds, and then you have industrial interests and financial interests. The finance and industry tends to be on the Hamiltonian side. The yeoman farmers are agrarian, they're Jeffersonians, and that's the original party split.
All right, so I can see, of course, they're urban versus rural. They're going to have different interests and different concerns. But how is it that there's this commonality that in the high-density setting, people seem to regard government as a complement to society, whereas in the rural areas, they seem to regard it as a substitute for society?
I don't know how much this necessarily impacts that, but I think one thing that we see a lot in these larger cities that have a blue sector where the rest of the state is, notably where I'm from, Miami, is blue, is in fact red. And I think one of the phenomenons that's interesting is the aspect of Miami is very welcoming. So you have very affluent people that make it there that were already affluent. You have people that have gotten there and became affluent through meeting some of these people. And then you have a whole sector of people that are trying to get there, some that will, some that won't. And I think there's more camaraderie in cities like that. And I think camaraderie as an aspect of community makes people not necessarily vote for more government, but tend to vote for that person which is going to be more community-based. And I think, generally speaking, the Republican's going to be more individual-based. He's going to say liberty for all, individualism, libertarianism, etc., while the Democrats are going to look more into the community side.
So cities tend to arise where there are surpluses. When we think about like when did we see the emergence of cities in human history, it's when human beings learned to engage in agriculture where you could store grain. For example, if you miss a crop, you might live, right? Farmers can't count on that. And so they're staking everything on being able to support themselves in this year. You can't bank on your neighbors or anybody else stepping in to save you from bad decisions or just the happenstance of a drought or some other disaster. And I think this, to some extent, articulates the divide between the agrarian and the city dweller. If you live in a city, it's not unreasonable to say, hey, look, we're all in this together. And if I made some bad decisions, come and help bail me out. But if you're a farmer on the edge of the frontier where everybody's living on a subsistence basis, you can't look at your neighbor and say, I made some bad decisions. Let me have half of your crops so that I don't die. And I think this may, to some extent, shape our attitude towards government and what it's reasonable to expect of government and what it's not.
Okay, that is the best explanation I've heard. But if you follow that logic outside of a framework of federalism, you've got a big problem.
Right.
Because the one side is going to try and impose its view on the other, thinking that, of course, it's right because that's our lived experience. But in a federalist system, you can have both things, the rural people depending on themselves and the urban people depending on government. But somehow we've ended up in this situation, it seems, where either the Reds or the Blues take over and they want to impose their view on everybody else.
You should be very, very careful about asserting that one is right and one is wrong. That's one of the reasons why we have a bicameral chamber, right? Where we've got a Senate that is not representative and a House of Representatives that is, because it's not clear who you should back in the argument, and maybe you should let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let the farmers have their say and let the city dwellers have their say, but don't let the people who happen to live in urban environments swamp the people who are out there at the very edge of survival, who are staking the most and saying, if I make bad decisions, I might not survive. People in the cities aren't risking as much, I think, as the people on the frontiers.
And Clark, the thing that we tend not to think about when we think about bicameralism is that the setup is such that, yes, the House is immediately representative. Any hot button issue in society can take over the House in its entirety right now. But only a third of the Senate is up for election at any 2-year stretch. So it's going to take 6 full years, 3 cycles. And by the time you get to that third cycle, the framers hoped that whatever it was that had ignited the passions would have gone out and it would just die under its own weight. And lo and behold, that's about what happens. The real danger in America is majority faction, and it's an open question as to whether we've ever had one. I think we have. I think it's progressivism. I think that's the only thing that fits the description that you can make a strong case for. And I think you can make a strong case on the other side of that too, right? But I think if we've ever had a majority faction, that's it, because those issues lasted longer than the election cycle. It took actually 2 full election cycles.
I want to hear Phil's opinion, but before we go there, can you define majority-minority faction?
No, we'll let that. I mean, you don't have to. A faction, according to Madison and the definition everybody uses from Federalist 10, is a number of people, whether amounting to a majority or a minority, so they're both the same, except for their number, actuated by a common impulse that is contrary to the aggregate interests of the community. Yeah. I think that's close.
Oh, no, you got it.
Page 43 of the Liberty Fund edition, if you've got that one in front of you. So we have minority factions all the time, right? And it's one stupid thing after another. And you can think of the Klan, if you want, or the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA. These are things that are destructive in various ways. And they get exorcised pretty quickly from American politics.
Because they're a minority.
And because they're so crazy and everybody knows it. It's the things that don't appear so crazy and that not everybody knows. That's where you're going to find a majority faction. People are going to be blinded to it. And they're going to think it's a really good thing when in the end it's a really destructive thing.
You, Phil?
Yeah. Well, if you think about a typical majoritarian democracy, the premise is if you get 50% plus 1, you win. But that's actually not an ideal situation for society, because what happens to the other 49.999%? You're actually in a position where that 50% plus 1 could impose a lot of harms, a lot of costs on a large swath of society that is just out of reach of being able to defend itself. The whole premise of our system of government is you chop up the different mechanisms of attaining a majority into multiple pieces. And suddenly, in an aggregate, it actually turns out that you need more than a majority of 50% plus 1 to pass any legislation or to get something through Congress and then to the president and then to sustain Supreme Court review.
Something that a lot of people will find a foreign thought. The United States government was designed to function poorly.
Yeah.
It's designed to be inefficient.
I love this.
Can I riff on that real quick? The biggest mistake I think people make is to suppose that we live in a majoritarian system.
Yeah.
We don't. We live in a super majoritarian system. And let me just tick off some of the ways in which that is true. So the process for a bill becoming law enables the president to veto a law that has majoritarian support, right? Then it has to go back to the Congress to receive 2/3 support, right? So every step of the way, there are certain bills that can only originate in the House, revenue-raising bills. So there are all these limits on simple majoritarianism. In some ways, the most stark and evocative one is the government can't hurt you unless a unanimous jury of your neighbors agrees. That is astonishing. 12 people have to come together when the government tries to punish you and listen to everything that's happened and say, every single one of us agrees that you should have to go to prison, right? Or pay the fine or whatever it is. Now, that's a far cry from where we are now because the courts have undercut that basic constitutional structure. But the extent to which our Constitution is designed to be not merely majoritarian, but supermajoritarian, where unless there's an overwhelming consensus that you shouldn't be doing that thing, the government has no effective power to stop you from doing that thing. It leaps off the page of the Constitution. And if we were more like that society, where unless you were a direct and present threat to the peaceful existence of your neighbors, it couldn't touch you, there would be so much less conflict than there is.
It gets a little deeper than that too, right? Because you left out the Supreme Court. And how do you get on the Supreme Court? The president nominates you and the Senate confirms you. No democratically elected official has anything to say about it, right? Because remember, the president was elected by the Electoral College. The Senate was elected by the state legislature under the original design of the Constitution. And that's how you get on the court. And once you're on the court, you could do damn well whatever you want.
James, what's the single best thing a Supreme Court justice can say to the other branches of government?
Just stop. And that's the only way the other branches are forced to listen.
Absolutely. And give us a clear, rational, and persuasive explanation of why you get to do this thing.
That's right.
Or stop. That's exactly right.
You mentioned something really interesting, which is that our government's not meant to run efficiently, which I've used in several explanations to people, both in my world and otherwise. And I'd actually love for you to talk about that. Really.
Well, I mean, Clark kind of lays it all out when he starts talking about how a bill becomes a law. And, you know, this is schoolhouse rock stuff. We all know it. But we tend
If only.
Cue the schoolhouse rock.
Point taken. But we don't think about it very often, right? Because it's just structural nonsense. But it's not nonsense. It's structural, but it's not nonsense. And it's not even checks and balances. That's the phrase that everybody learns when they're young. But if you go to Federalist 9, the actual phrase is partial agency. And what you find is that each branch has the ability to mess about with the authorities of the other branches. And they do when they can. But when can they? And isn't that interesting, right? You get all kinds of answers here. And when you throw it into the stew, if left to their own devices, people in government can't accomplish much of anything. Thank God. What can they accomplish? Well, things that really need to be done tend to get done. And apart from that, we're always playing from behind. And, you know, American politics is a constant game of catch-up. Why didn't we solve this problem 20 years ago is what everybody says. Well, we didn't because we couldn't, because of the system that's designed for us. And when somebody like Ross Perot, who is a good businessman, near as I can tell, Phil's probably already shaking his head.
Not the worst.
When Ross Perot shows up and says, I'm going to run America like a business.
That is spot on. That's literally what it sounded like.
He can't, because it's not designed to do that. It's just literally impossible. So every time you hear a man saying he's going to run our government like a business, he's lying. Because anybody who's gotten to that place where he can say that knows it's incorrect.
He might not be lying. This might just be stupid.
He knows it's incorrect. He just thinks the people want to hear it.
Yeah.
I had a conversation about that, about Bernie Sanders there. And somebody was saying, he's all good, he's all natured. I go, I'd love to believe that. And I'd love to believe that he is just naive, maybe is a poor word for it, but you get what I mean. I think nobody gets to the position that Bernie is in without having a very deep understanding of how some of this works and knowing that what you're saying is just playing to your audience.
Well, that's what makes me think someone like Sanders is malicious. He actually does know how to game the system. There's something here in the rhetoric of democracy. We hear this term thrown out. We heard it in the election the other day. If the outcome doesn't come out the way that my party or my candidate wins, it's a threat to democracy. It's all over, which I think is utter nonsense. But they use the term democracy as stuff I like and everything I dislike is undemocratic. And you see both parties doing this. It's
right. Yeah. So you're talking about Sanders, but we've seen both parties do it. And the clearest evidence is 4 years ago, it was the Democrats saying, well, look, this is the result of democracy. And the Republicans saying, no, we were gypped. And now it's the other way around.
The funniest thing in the world is watching Democrats become election deniers.
Yes. It happens every 4 to 8 years, you know.
How the hell did we get here? They've been scolding us for 4 years on the evils of election denial.
But this is interesting in that if you are convinced that you are right, be you Republican, Democrat, or anything in between, any democratic outcome that flies in the face of what you believe is correct must, in your world, be a flawed outcome, that there's something wrong with democracy.
But there's not an anointed few who get to know what's correct. Thank God in heaven. Think about where we'd be if we just acquiesced to those somehow superpowered few who know best what we should do. You're talking about totalitarianism when it comes right down to it. We've cast our lines against that sort of thinking. The price of doing that is that you don't get certitude. You don't get an answer that we can all rally behind. I happen to see that as a strength, not a weakness, a feature, not a bug, right? It's best that we can't do that sort of thing, because everywhere we see that happening, it turns out to be a disaster in the end, literally everywhere.
One of the hardest questions, I think, of living in what we'll just call generically a democracy, right? Which is to say, a country where no one person or self-appointed cabal of people get to say, we know what's best for everybody and we're going to impose it on you, right? It's a really hard question of how much say to give to ordinary people, right? Because H.L. Mencken has famously said that democracy is the theory that the common man knows what he wants and deserves to get it good and hard, right? So what we've chosen instead is a representative form of government, right? We vote for legislative representatives. We have an electoral college, so we don't elect a president by pure...
Yeah, but we don't use it.
Well, yes and no. What do you mean, Ann?
To my mind, the way the electoral college should work, and James will correct me when I say this is what was intended, but is that it should work like the legislature works, like Congress works, that we elect people and their job is to go figure out who the president is.
Well, close. Their job is to save us from any utter stupidity we might engage in.
Sure. And you and I argued this back when Hillary was running against Trump.
Yeah.
The Electoral College should do its job because it was clear that the majority of Americans didn't want either one. Let the Electoral College do its job and elect neither.
Pick somebody else, please. But the Electoral College has come to do something more. It goes back to your opening comment, right? When you take a look at the county map in the United States, and it's all red, except for these little blue outposts. Well, come to find out, the Electoral College represents both people and places. And that's really important because places make things like food, which is what Clark was talking about earlier. And if you just dismiss their interests out of hand, you don't get any food. And that's going to be a real problem. So what does the Electoral College do? It takes the number of representatives in a state, which means population matters, and then it adds 2, because you get 2 senators. And that has the net effect of boosting the influence of very small states. So Wyoming, that has 500,000 people, still gets 3 electoral votes. And you might think that that's not important, but I can name you a couple of elections where it was incredibly important. And it keeps these places on the view of politicians as they campaign for these offices. You have to take Nevada seriously, for example, in this last election. Iowa was in play, it seemed, for a while. And these are places with very few electoral votes, comparatively speaking, and they became incredibly important. My state of Arizona, very important.
I think a big thing that has changed is the importance of the proverbial smoke-filled room, right?
Let's go back to them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And not just because you like cigars.
I am full square in favor of doing away with the process we now have and going back to the smoke-filled rooms of the conventions.
Drill down on this a bit. And I'm sorry.
No,
I don't mean to
go ahead.
steal your host. So if you had to choose between 2 candidates for your party, and I think we're stuck for the time being with a 2-party system. Let's just, I don't love it.
That's not going anywhere.
That's right. We are. So if you had to choose between somebody who has demonstrated that they are incredibly adept at reaching out to people who do not automatically agree with them, right? Who can get 51% of a contentious electorate by appealing to the people who already believe what they believe, but then reaching out and saying, hey, you know what? We may not agree on everything. Here's where we have a lot of common. And then they pull in the 51% versus the people who are incredibly adept at stroking the political erogenous zones of a smaller 20, 30%, like, you know what? If I get to be president, we will do all the things to the people you don't like, and you will love it. I will be your avatar.
I will get even for you.
That's right.
Yeah.
So up until 20 or 30 years ago, maybe not even that recently, our system favored the emergence of the person who could get through the smoke-filled room and convince a bunch of politically seasoned people who've been through multiple elections, I can get 51% of the American people on my side. We left that in our wake. And now what we do is we elevate to the candidacy of the 2 major parties the person who can most vigorously stroke the political erogenous zone of 20 to 30% of the population, and they become the nominee. And then it becomes a choice between 2 manifestly unfit, objectionable, horrible candidates. And we are left with the absolute choice that we had to choose between.
Yep, that's right. But I ask you, would you not have preferred If the Democratic Party said, you know what, Mayor Pete, he's an interesting guy. He's really smart. He speaks apparently 7 languages. He doesn't seem to offend people when he does speak those languages. Wouldn't that be something? And the Republicans said, Condoleezza Rice, what's she up to these days? She seems eminently qualified for this office. Let's maybe run her. And you could have a choice like that. And I would submit that that's a good choice to have. Way better than the show we just got, which is a dump no matter how you look at it. Can you vote for either one of these clowns with any charity in your heart? I'm here to tell you, I felt very dirty casting my vote. Not going to tell you who it was for, because what the hell's the difference?
I voted for my wife, so I felt good. But you know what?
I did the right-in route.
Can I propose something? How about we assign responsibility for where we've come to? Because I got an answer that will be different, I think, from most of yours. Can we go around the table with that?
What are you asking?
Who's
to
most
blame?
Responsible for where we find ourselves, where instead of the candidate who is the most politically appealing to the most number of people in this country, we have to choose between two candidates who are the most appealing to some marginal, craptacular minority of people in our
I would lay the blame squarely on the huge number of centrist voters who don't bother voting.
I've got a different candidate. Around the table.
I'll just say FDR.
Not Woodrow Wilson.
It's a close second.
That's interesting. I'm glad that somebody else got to go first, too, because I'm sitting here thinking, if I had to pick, it would be very off topic, I guess, because it seems like the election now may as well just be between the 2 biggest TikTok stars. Yep. So if I were just to have to pick, which I don't think they're squarely to blame, but let's just go with social media.
You're right, and I know whose fault that is. Okay.
I'm going back in time to stand next to my friend Phil and say not only was it FDR, but it was everybody who thought that there should be a new deal because they thought the old deal was no longer good enough.
Well, they rose the stakes of winning.
That's right. And I lay the blame not at FDR specifically, but at the feet of him and everybody like him during a certain period of our history.
So you all have good answers. They're all wrong. But James will know almost reflexively who's responsible when I say, James, tell me, who's the villain in this drama?
Oh, the Supreme Court. Clark's answer to every awful question is the United States Supreme Court, and he's not necessarily wrong. You may.
When I was a kid, I lived in a suburb of Boston where you had a couple of acres of...
Which suburb did you live in?
Well, why would you do that?
Because I
Lincoln, Massachusetts.
Excellent.
Wrong side of the tracks.
Excellent.
Not with a prep.
Now I know more about you.
This is the part that we cut out.
Yeah. All right. One summer, for reasons I don't fully understand, we decided to have a couple of goats. And the thing about a goat that you need to understand is that if it gets into the room where the goat feed is, it will eat absolutely every bit of goat food until its stomach explodes and it dies, which almost happened. And that's Congress, right? That's every political branch. And so however much power you let them exercise is the amount they will exercise. So the Supreme Court turns out to be really important, right? And the Supreme Court has struggled to articulate a coherent theory of the distinction between speech and unprotected political advocacy. And I actually don't think there's a bright line distinction between those, right? So can you spend money to amplify your political message? Of course. Is that speech? Not exactly, right? Could the government prohibit you from owning a printer so you could get your message out about whatever it is you care about, like, end the public schools or stop the war in wherever? No. So what the Supreme Court did that let us all down was that in a series of so-called campaign finance cases, the Supreme Court, it didn't completely abandon the position, but it gave the government too much power to prevent people from spending money to articulate a political message, spending money to support a particular candidate, spending money to convince the public that this path was better than the other path. And what it basically did was, at the end of the day, it burned down the smoke-filled rooms. So now, if you're a candidate, where does most of your money come from? It doesn't come from your political party. It comes from a bunch of jabronis who are sending in $10, $20, $30. These are the people whose glands are exposed. Send me an email and I'll send you $30. Right.
Well, I mean, look, this is why barriers to entry have become so high. People in power make sure that people out of power stay where they are, because that's part of staying in power. And I lay the blame at the Supreme Court, too, in a very specific way. They keep going after these things as if they were free speech issues, but they're property rights issues. And they just dismiss it out of hand as if it were never the case.
So what are the things and why are they property issues?
Because I get it. If I have $1 million and it's mine and I got it legitimately and I want to give it to you so you can run for political office, I got a problem. And so does everybody else with a certain amount of money or more, which is why Kamala Harris keeps asking me for $5. Even after the election is over, she apparently still needs $5.
Oh my God. So can I just make something clear? It is so disgusting when Elon Musk spends money to get Trump elected, but not at all disgusting when George Soros spends money.
Yeah, exactly so.
It's righteous money.
Be clear about that, right?
Somehow it's completely different.
There are people who would hear what I just said and go, yeah, obviously.
That's right.
Right?
So I want to shift gears as time goes on here. President Trump has been elected.
President-elect Trump.
What baffles me is, largely speaking, he's a pro-market president, at least relative to the alternative, but he's a protectionist.
He absolutely
president.
is.
So, Mikhail, this question goes to you, the supply chain guy. Trump has said that if elected, he would impose all sorts of tariffs. In fact, he argued at one point that he would replace the income and payroll taxes with tariffs, which I say mathematically isn't possible. But from your perspective on the supply chain side, what does this mean for U.S. imports?
The way that I've been answering this question on social media, where I see constantly people saying things like, I hope the small business in town that voted for Trump goes out of business because of tariffs. I don't think they're realizing that these tariffs have been here for quite a while. Every Chinese-made good that you have has had a 25% tariff on it for the past 2 years.
25%.
25% tariff. And one of the conversations I had earlier was we're currently importing about $102 million worth of goods. The reason why we got the business was because we were able to consult effectively on how to mitigate that tariff as much as possible, because it's all coming out of China. The good news is it would have cost about $1 billion to develop here, but
All right, I got to stop you there. How do you mitigate the tariff?
there's creative solutions. For example, one thing most people get
There's always a loophole.
fair.
Not a loophole.
After about a year's worth of conversations, I get what's called a packing list and a commercial invoice for this project. And I look at both and I see both and I say, okay, this is $102 million worth of goods. How much did you guys pay for your packaging? And immediately an entire boardroom goes, what? And I go, how much did you pay for the packaging of the crates and the metal bars and everything else? And then specifically, they wanted this to be in a certain term where they're delivering it over to the port. How much did you guys pay for all this? No one knew. These are high-end professional finance people. So we go back to the seller. And I probably shouldn't publicize this ultimately on a podcast, but it is what it is. And the seller goes, I don't know. And I go, okay, well, what are we going to do here? She goes, well, send me how much you want the packaging to cost. I go, no problem at all. We need it to cost about 40%. And I have a WhatsApp, WeChat conversation of this happening all the way. And I sent her the commercial invoice and she emailed me right back with her signature and the company letterhead and everything else that we need. Now, how much did the packaging cost? I mean, legitimately, questionably about 30%, 40%. I mean, this is some heavier packaging and that sort of thing. But the larger point of this is that while this company and this project is relatively small and this company is big financially, these larger companies are not dumb. They've known this for many, many years. And a lot of the costs and a lot of the inflationary prices that we see these days are not just from the dollars that we printed that now we need to cost this. It's from these companies anticipating the tariffs that are ultimately going to be coming down. Not to mention the fact that Biden, right before he dropped out, with the full support of Kamala, came out and said, all this building material is going to be tariffed if I get elected. 40% on all kinds of steel. Same as Trump stopped USX from selling to the Japanese company, which I don't know what's happening there now. It's questionable, but it could save 20,000 jobs in our fun city of Pittsburgh as part of it. There is no results that would have worked out here where we would have seen a diminishing in tariff or duty or cost. These were coming down the pipeline, and an opinion that people probably may be a little bit surprised, China deserves this. One way or the other, we can talk about how COVID came about and whatnot. And I know in one of my first episodes, I mentioned that I'm not going to go into the conspiracy theory around this, but I do believe that there's an opportunist in any government out there. And you don't need to communicate overly well with another government to make sure that you're okay. And I think in some regard, we need to put a little bit of pressure on those. And in addition, what it ultimately renders is a response. And what you're seeing now is a lot of these big companies, from your Walgreens that are getting procurement, from those small companies that are out there, they're going to other places. And those other places are basically just buying from China, importing down, and they have a comparative advantage. And try calling Ensenada right now. Try calling a factory in Ensenada and not speaking Mandarin, because they're all there. And Mexican imports are not the same tariffs that Chinese imports are. So whoever gets elected, these companies have already taken proactive steps to both avoid and benefit from what's coming up.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.